The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Colonel Marcus Briggs pressed the handset against his ear, straining to hear through the interference that seemed to swallow voices whole in these godforsaken valleys. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he crouched behind a boulder, watching his men's silhouettes against the star-drunk sky. 27 soldiers. Good men. All of them about to die. "Command, this is Viper 6, Briggs whispered into the radio, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We are compromised. Repeat, we are compromised. Taliban forces have us surrounded on 3 sides. Request immediate air support." The response came through broken and distant. "Viper 6, negative on air support. All assets committed elsewhere. You're alone until sunrise." Sunrise, 6 hours away. Briggs closed his eyes and felt the weight of every decision that had led them here. The intelligence that seemed too good to be true, the timing that felt rushed, the nagging voice in his gut that he'd ignored because the mission parameters looked clean on paper. Now his Rangers were trapped in a kill box, outnumbered 4-1, with Taliban fighters closing in like wolves sensing wounded prey. The colonel's radio operator, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, caught his eye and shook his head grimly. The kid was barely 22, but his eyes held the ancient understanding that comes to soldiers in moments like these. They both knew what "alone until sunrise" meant in military speak. It meant write your letters home. It meant make peace with whatever god you pray to. It meant the brass had already written them off as acceptable losses in someone else's war. That's when the sound came, distant at first, like thunder rolling across mountain peaks, but growing stronger, deeper, more purposeful. The unmistakable growl of turbofan engines cutting through thin mountain air. Briggs felt his heart skip as he recognized the sound, even though it seemed impossible. The distinctive twin-engine rumble of an A-10 Thunderbolt, that ugly, beloved, tank-killing angel of death that pilots called the Warthog. But there were no A-10s scheduled for this sector. Command had been crystal clear about that. Every available aircraft was committed to operations 300 miles south. So what was that sound growing louder in the darkness above them, and who was flying a close air support mission that officially didn't exist? Staff Sergeant Maya Krishnan adjusted her night vision goggles and checked her ammunition count for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. 47 rounds left in her primary magazine. 2 frag grenades. 1 smoke canister. Not much to work with when you're about to make the kind of stand that songs get written about, if anyone survives to write them. She'd been in tight spots before, but nothing quite like this. The Taliban had moved with coordinated precision, cutting off their exfiltration routes and herding them into this rocky outcropping like sheep into a pen. The sound of approaching aircraft made her look up, squinting into the star field above. She knew that engine's signature. Every ground pounder did. The A-10 was built for moments exactly like this, when infantry needed someone to rain hell from above and ask questions later. But as far as she knew, there weren't any hogs in theater tonight. Command had been explicit about that during the mission briefing. "You hear that?" Rodriguez whispered, crawling up beside her. His radio was still crackling with intermittent chatter, most of it unintelligible through the static and distance. "Sounds like Warthog," Krishnan finished. "But there ain't supposed to be any warthogs out here tonight." Colonel Briggs was moving among his men now, using hand signals to reposition them for whatever was coming. The Taliban fighters were getting bolder, their muzzle flashes appearing closer to their position with each passing minute. In the pale starlight, Krishnan could see the colonel's face, grim but determined, the expression of a man who'd accepted his fate but refused to go quietly. He'd been a good officer during their deployment, the kind who remembered his soldiers' names and asked about their families back home. The kind who ate MREs with his men instead of hoarding the good rations in the command tent. The aircraft sound was getting closer now, no longer just a distant rumble but a definitive presence in the sky above them. Krishnan pulled out her infrared strobe and held it ready, though she wasn't sure if whoever was up there would be looking for them or even knew they existed. Sometimes pilots flew missions that existed in the shadows between official orders and moral imperatives. Sometimes good people did the right thing even when the right thing wasn't technically authorized. A burst of automatic weapons fire erupted from the ridge line to their east, followed immediately by the angry whistle of bullets passing overhead. The Taliban were testing their defenses, probing for weak spots in their perimeter. It wouldn't be long now before the real assault began, and when it did, 27 Americans would discover what it meant to fight outnumbered in terrain that favored their enemies. But that sound in the sky kept growing louder, carrying with it the faintest possibility that sunrise might not be the last thing they'd ever see. Krishnan activated her strobe and pointed it toward the sound of salvation that shouldn't exist but somehow did, hopping against hope that someone up there was looking down with friendly eyes and weapons hot. The A-10 Thunderbolt II materialized out of the darkness like something conjured from the collective prayers of desperate soldiers. At first, it was just a shadow against the stars, darker than the night sky, moving with the purposeful grace of a predator that had found its prey. Then the moonlight caught its distinctive silhouette, the twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, the straight wings built for low and slow death dealing, the massive GAU-8 cannon protruding from its nose like the stinger of some mechanical wasp. Captain Alexis Phoenix Restrepo had been flying combat missions for 6 years, but she'd never seen anything quite like the thermal signature blooming across her targeting display. 27 American soldiers clustered in defensive positions, surrounded by at least 100 enemy fighters moving with tactical precision through the rocky terrain. The odds were ugly, the kind that made even experienced pilots think twice about getting involved. But Phoenix had never been the kind to think twice when Americans were dying below. She'd earned her call sign during her first deployment in Iraq, when she'd guided a damaged Apache helicopter to safety after its pilot had been wounded by small arms fire. The Apache crew had been sure they were going to die, until Phoenix's voice came over the radio, calm and steady, talking them through an emergency landing that should have been impossible. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, the pilot had said later, and the name had stuck. Now she banked her Warthog into a wide circle above the battlefield, studying the tactical situation through her night vision systems. The Taliban forces were well positioned, using the natural rock formations to conceal their movement while maintaining overlapping fields of fire on the American position. It was a professionally executed ambush, the kind that suggested enemy commanders who knew their business and had planned this operation carefully. Phoenix keyed her radio to the emergency frequency, hoping the soldiers below had someone monitoring. Any U.S. forces in Grid Square Papa Delta 74, this is Hog 27. I see your strobes. What's your situation? The response came immediately, tinged with the kind of desperation that makes men's voices crack. Hog 27, this is Viper 6. We are 27 Rangers surrounded and outnumbered. We have wounded and are running low on ammunition. Request immediate close air support. Copy that, Viper 6. I'm going to need you to mark your perimeter with IR strobes and get your heads down. This is going to get loud. Phoenix rolled her aircraft into a steep dive, feeling the familiar weight of gravity pressing against her flight suit. The A-10 wasn't built for speed or altitude. It was built for moments exactly like this, when close air support meant the difference between soldiers going home to their families and soldiers coming home in flag-draped boxes. The massive Avenger cannon in her nose held 1,174 rounds of 30-depleted uranium shells, each one capable of punching through tank armor or turning human beings into pink mist. Below her, muzzle flashes erupted across the mountainside as the Taliban fighters opened fire on the surrounded Americans. Phoenix could see the tracers arcing through the darkness, the deadly light show that meant men were dying while she circled above like some mechanical angel of death, trying to decide where to bring the thunder. The first gun run would be the most important. It had to be precise, devastating, and close enough to the American position to break the enemy's momentum without killing the very soldiers she was trying to save. Phoenix had made runs like this before, threading the needle between friendly forces and enemy positions with margins measured in meters rather than miles. It was the kind of flying that separated competent pilots from legends, the kind that either made careers or ended them in spectacular fashion. She armed her cannon and rolled into the attack, the night sky suddenly alive with the possibility of salvation delivered at the speed of sound and the rate of 65 rounds per second. Below, 27 Rangers prepared to discover what it meant to have an angel watching over them, even when headquarters had written them off as ghosts. The first burst from Phoenix's GAU-8 cannon tore through the night like the voice of an angry god, a sound that started deep in the chest and ended in the bones. Each round weighed nearly a pound and traveled at speeds that turned human bodies into component molecules. The distinctive BRRRRRT sound echoed off the mountain faces, followed by the secondary explosions of ammunition cooking off and fuel tanks igniting in brilliant orange fireballs. Colonel Briggs pressed himself against the rocky ground as pieces of shrapnel whistled overhead, his radio crackling with confused chatter from his squad leaders. The A-10's first gun run had been surgical in its precision, walking a line of destruction along the eastern ridge, where the heaviest concentration of Taliban fighters had been massing for their assault. In the space of 3 seconds, Phoenix had eliminated an entire squad of enemy combatants and their heavy weapons position. "Viper 6, this is Hog 27, came the calm voice over the radio. Female, Briggs noted with surprise, though he'd heard rumors about women flying close air support missions. "I count multiple secondary explosions on your eastern perimeter. Can you confirm enemy casualties?" Briggs raised his head cautiously, peering through his night vision scope at the smoldering ruins of what had been a Taliban strongpoint minutes earlier. Bodies were scattered among the rocks, some still moving weakly, others clearly beyond any earthly concerns. A heavy machine gun that had been hammering their position was now twisted metal and silence. Hog 27 confirmed multiple enemy KIA on Eastern Ridge. That was some fine shooting, pilot. Just getting started, Viper 6. I've got plenty more where that came from. Staff Sergeant Krishnan felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. The A-10 was already banking for another run, its twin engines growling with predatory satisfaction. She'd been in enough firefights to know the sound of momentum shifting, and right now it was shifting in their favor. The Taliban fighters who had been so bold minutes earlier were now scrambling for cover, their coordinated assault falling apart under the weight of 30 cannon fire. Phoenix lined up her second gun run on the northern slope, where thermal imagery showed another concentration of enemy fighters. This time she mixed cannon fire with a pair of Maverick missiles, the AGM-65s streaking down from the darkness to detonate among the rock formations, where muzzle flashes had been winking like deadly stars. The explosions lit up the mountainside in stark relief, revealing the scope of the Taliban force that had been preparing to overrun the American position. The tactical situation was becoming clear to Phoenix as she circled for another pass. This hadn't been a chance encounter or opportunistic ambush. The enemy had laid a carefully planned trap, using intelligence assets to predict the Rangers' movement and position overwhelming force at exactly the right time and place. It was the kind of operation that suggested Taliban commanders with serious military training and access to real-time intelligence, which raised uncomfortable questions about how they'd known where to find Colonel Briggs and his men in the first place. But those were questions for after the shooting stopped. Right now, Phoenix had more immediate concerns, like the shoulder-fired missile that had just streaked past her cockpit, missing her starboard engine by less than 50 feet. "Viper 6, be advised I'm taking SAM fire from your western approach," she radioed, pulling her aircraft into a tight spiraling climb. These guys came prepared for air support. The Stinger missile had been a game-changer, proof that the Taliban force below wasn't just another band of fighters with AK-47s and improvised explosive devices. They had modern anti-aircraft weapons and operators trained to use them effectively. Phoenix felt her pulse quicken as she realized this engagement was about to become significantly more dangerous. But she'd flown through SAM threats before, and the A-10 was built to absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. The Warthog could fly home with engines shot out, hydraulics severed, and half its control surfaces missing. It was designed by engineers who understood that close air support meant flying into harm's way, not around it. Phoenix rolled into another attack run, this time approaching from the south where her thermal sensors showed fewer enemy positions. The Taliban fighters were learning to respect her cannon, but they were also adapting their tactics, spreading out and using the rocky terrain to limit her target opportunities. It was going to be a long night, and ammunition wasn't infinite, even for an A-10. Below, Colonel Briggs watched the deadly ballet playing out above his head and felt something he hadn't experienced since the ambush began, the possibility that his soldiers might actually see another sunrise. But he also knew that one A-10, however skillfully flown, couldn't hold off an entire Taliban company indefinitely. Eventually, Phoenix would run out of ammunition or fuel, and when she did, the enemy would close in for the kill. Unless she could break their will to fight before her own resources ran dry. It was going to be a race between firepower and time, played out at altitudes measured in hundreds of feet and speeds measured in the heartbeats of desperate men. The third gun run took Phoenix directly over the American position, close enough that Colonel Briggs could see the muzzle flashes from her cannon, illuminating the cockpit in brief, strobing intervals. She was flying danger close now, walking her fire within meters of the friendly perimeter, using precision that came from years of training and instincts honed in combat zones, where mistakes meant friendly fire casualties. The psychological effect on the Taliban fighters was as important as the physical destruction. Phoenix understood that close air support wasn't just about killing enemy combatants. It was about breaking their will to continue fighting. Every gun run that landed precisely on target sent a message to the survivors. Nowhere was safe, nowhere was beyond the reach of American firepower, and continuing this fight meant certain death. She could see the change in their movement patterns through her thermal imaging system. Where minutes earlier they had been advancing with coordinated aggression, now they were hesitating, seeking deeper cover, looking over their shoulders at the sky where death circled on twin turbofan engines. Some were already pulling back from advanced positions, their appetite for martyrdom diminished by the reality of modern aerial warfare. Viper 6, I'm seeing enemy movement to your south, Phoenix radioed. Looks like a squad-sized element trying to flank your position. Permission to engage. Granted. Hog 27, light them up. The fourth gun run was Phoenix's most challenging yet, requiring her to thread fire between two rock formations while avoiding a ridgeline that would have put her aircraft in danger of ground collision. She rolled inverted at the last second, firing a brief burst that caught the flanking Taliban squad in open ground. The third-aim rounds impacted like miniature artillery shells, sending up geysers of rock and dirt in silence. Staff Sergeant Krishnan watched the gun run through her night vision scope and felt a professional admiration for the pilot's skill. Whoever was flying that A-10 knew their business, placing fire with the kind of precision that separated true experts from merely competent aviators. The pilot was taking risks too, flying patterns that brought the aircraft well within range of small arms fire and man-portable air defense systems. That pilot's got brass ones, Rodriguez whispered, ejecting a spent magazine and sliding a fresh one into his rifle. The sustained firefight had chewed through their ammunition reserves, but the A-10's intervention had bought them breathing room and shifted the tactical momentum in their favor. Phoenix was feeling the effects of sustained combat flying now, the adrenaline surge that made every sense hyperacute while simultaneously exhausting the nervous system. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the frigid air at altitude, and her hands had the slight tremor that came from gripping the stick too tightly for too long. She'd been in combat for 23 minutes, which felt like hours when measured in heartbeats and muzzle flashes. Her ammunition counter showed 847 rounds remaining in the GAU-8 cannon, plus 2 Maverick missiles and a full load of 2.75-inch rockets. Enough firepower to continue the engagement, but she needed to start thinking strategically about target prioritization. The Taliban force was larger than initially assessed, and they were showing more tactical sophistication than the average insurgent group. A new voice crackled over the radio, different from Colonel Briggs, younger and tinged with the kind of urgency that meant someone was bleeding. "Hog 27, this is Viper 7. We've got wounded who need immediate medevac, but we can't establish a landing zone while taking fire. Can you clear the western slope?" Phoenix banked toward the coordinates, studying the thermal signatures scattered across the rocky terrain. The western slope was honeycombed with natural caves and overhangs that provided perfect concealment for enemy fighters. Rooting them out would require multiple gun runs and careful ammunition management. But if American soldiers were wounded and needed evacuation, that changed everything. Mission parameters shifted from harassment and interdiction to search and destroy. Viper 7, I copy wounded requiring medevac. Stand by for close air support on western slope. This is going to take some time. Phoenix armed her rockets and rolled into the attack, knowing that the next phase of the engagement would test every skill she'd learned in 6 years of combat flying. Below her, wounded Rangers waited for salvation, while Taliban fighters prepared to fight to the death in terrain that favored defenders over attackers, even when the attackers had wings and carried enough firepower to level city blocks. The western slope erupted in overlapping explosions as Phoenix's rocket pods emptied their deadly cargo into the cave systems where enemy fighters had taken refuge. The 2.75-inch high-explosive warheads weren't as precise as cannon fire, but they were devastating against area targets, collapsing cave mouths and sealing Taliban combatants inside their rocky tombs. Secondary explosions suggested ammunition storage areas, their contents cooking off in brilliant flashes that briefly turned night into day. Colonel Briggs was coordinating the medevac preparation with his medic, Sergeant Martinez, who'd been keeping 2 wounded Rangers alive with field dressings and morphine since the ambush began. Both soldiers had taken shrapnel from the initial barrage, one with abdominal wounds that needed surgical attention within hours, the other with a shattered femur that had turned his left leg into something that barely resembled human anatomy. "How long until we can get them out of here?" Briggs asked, watching Martinez work with the focused intensity of someone who understood that minutes meant the difference between amputation and full recovery. "Soon as that pilot clears us a landing zone," Martinez replied, not looking up from his work. "But they need a surgical suite, not a field hospital. Time's running short." Phoenix had moved to her Maverick missiles now, using the precision-guided munitions to eliminate specific targets that couldn't be reached effectively with cannon fire. Each missile cost more than most people's annual salary, but when American lives hung in the balance, cost-benefit analysis became irrelevant. She watched her targeting display track each warhead to impact, the thermal blooms confirming successful engagement of enemy positions. The Taliban resistance was beginning to crack. Phoenix could see it in their movement patterns, the way they were pulling back from advanced positions and consolidating into defensive clusters. The coordinated assault had devolved into a desperate holding action, with enemy fighters more concerned about survival than tactical objectives. It was the kind of psychological shift that turned battles into routes if exploited properly. "Viper 6, this is Hog 27, she radioed. "I'm showing significant enemy movement to the north. Looks like a general withdrawal. Your medevac window is opening up." Briggs felt a surge of relief that he tried not to show in his voice. "Copy that, Hog 27. We're marking the LZ with IR strobes now. The landing zone was a small clearing barely large enough for a Black Hawk helicopter, surrounded by rock formations that would make the approach treacherous even under ideal conditions. At night, with possible enemy fire from concealed positions, it would require a pilot with exceptional skill and significant courage. But Phoenix had learned long ago that medevac crews were a special breed of aviators, the kind who flew missions that existed in the overlap between suicidal and heroic. She established a holding pattern over the LZ, her sensors sweeping for thermal signatures that might indicate hidden enemy positions. The A-10's loiter capability was one of its greatest advantages. She could remain on station for hours if necessary, providing overwatch while ground operations unfolded. Other aircraft would have been forced to return to base for fuel by now, leaving the Rangers vulnerable during the most critical phase of their extraction. The sound of rotor blades appeared from the south, growing steadily stronger as a U-60 Black Hawk approached the landing zone. Phoenix could see the helicopter's navigation lights winking in the darkness, the pilots flying with the kind of controlled aggression that characterized combat medevac operations. They were coming in fast and steep, minimizing exposure time while maximizing their ability to extract wounded soldiers quickly. Medevac 7-2, this is Hog 27, Phoenix radioed. I have you in sight. LZ appears secure but recommend hot extraction procedures. I'll maintain overwatch during your ground time. Copy that, Hog 27, we're going in. The Black Hawk descended into the small clearing like a controlled crash, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust and debris that briefly obscured Phoenix's thermal imaging. She watched through her targeting system as small figures moved quickly between the aircraft and the American positions, carrying wounded soldiers on improvised stretchers. The entire operation took less than 3 minutes, but they were 3 of the longest minutes Phoenix had experienced since the engagement began. As the medevac helicopter climbed away from the LZ, Phoenix felt a satisfaction that went beyond successful mission completion. 2 American soldiers were now en route to medical care that would save their lives and possibly their limbs. In a war where victories were often measured in small increments and moral ambiguities, saving lives represented something unambiguously positive. But the engagement wasn't over. Colonel Briggs and his remaining Rangers were still surrounded, still outnumbered, and still hours away from sunrise. Phoenix checked her fuel and ammunition status, calculating how much longer she could maintain station over the battlefield. The numbers weren't encouraging, but they were sufficient to see this mission through to conclusion. The Taliban forces had used the medevac operation as an opportunity to reposition, and Phoenix could see new thermal signatures appearing in locations that had been clear minutes earlier. The enemy commanders were adapting their tactics, trying to exploit what they perceived as American vulnerabilities. It was time to remind them that the A-10 Thunderbolt II had been designed specifically to destroy concentrations of enemy forces in precisely these kinds of tactical situations. Phoenix rolled into another attack run, her cannon already spinning up to firing speed, ready to deliver 30 pounds of depleted uranium per second to anyone foolish enough to threaten American soldiers. The night was far from over, but momentum was clearly shifting in favor of the Rangers crouched among the rocks below, waiting for sunrise and extraction. The Taliban counterattack came at 5:12 hours, just as Phoenix was beginning to think the enemy had lost their appetite for continued combat. Thermal imagery showed approximately 40 fighters moving in coordinated bounds toward the American position, using fire and movement tactics that suggested professional military training rather than typical insurgent operations. They'd waited until they thought the A-10 pilot might be getting complacent, then launched what appeared to be a last desperate attempt to overrun the Ranger position before dawn. Phoenix had been flying combat air patrol for nearly 2 hours now, and fatigue was beginning to affect her reaction times and decision-making processes. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the initial phases of the engagement was giving way to the grinding exhaustion that comes from sustained high-stress operations. Her fuel gauge showed enough JP-8 for another hour of combat operations, maybe 90 minutes if she managed her throttle settings carefully. Viper 6, I'm seeing a large enemy formation moving on your position from multiple directions, she radioed, banking into a firing position. This looks like their final push. Get your people ready for close contact. Colonel Briggs acknowledged the transmission while moving among his soldiers, redistributing ammunition and preparing for what might be their last stand. His Rangers had performed magnificently under impossible conditions, but they were down to their final magazines and running on determination rather than resources. The A-10's intervention had bought them precious time, but time alone wouldn't be sufficient if the Taliban managed to close within grenade range. Phoenix's next gun run was her most aggressive yet, a low-altitude pass that brought her within 100 feet of the mountain peaks as she raked the advancing enemy formation with sustained cannon fire. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon was designed to destroy Soviet main battle tanks. Against human targets, its effects were so devastating they bordered on the surreal. Entire sections of the Taliban assault formation simply ceased to exist, replaced by craters and silence, and the metallic smell of vaporized blood. The psychological impact on the surviving attackers was immediate and decisive. Phoenix watched through her thermal imaging as the coordinated advance dissolved into panicked retreat, individual fighters abandoning their weapons and running for the safety of deeper caves and distant ridgelines. The counterattack that had promised to be their final victorious charge had instead become a rout of historic proportions. Staff Sergeant Krishnan watched the enemy withdraw through her night vision scope and felt something approaching amazement. In 36 months of combat deployments, she'd never seen anything quite like the precision and ferocity of the A-10's close air support. The pilot had been flying danger-close missions for hours, placing fire within meters of friendly positions without a single instance of fratricide or collateral damage. It was the kind of flying that belonged in textbooks and training manuals. "Whoever's flying that hog," she said to Rodriguez, "they just saved all our asses." Rodriguez nodded, ejecting his final magazine and checking the chamber of his rifle. "Think they'll stick around until sunrise?" Before Krishnan could answer, Phoenix's voice came over the radio with information that changed everything. "Viper 6, this is Hog 27. I've got multiple helicopter signatures approaching from the southeast, approximately 15 minutes out. Looks like your ride home just showed up." The extraction helicopters appeared as distant specks against the lightening eastern sky, growing steadily larger as they approached the battle-scarred mountainside where 25 Rangers waited for pickup. Phoenix established radio contact with the flight leader, coordinating approach routes and landing sequences while maintaining overwatch for any remaining enemy activity. Her fuel gauge was showing critical levels now, but she had enough JP-8 remaining to see the extraction through to completion. Colonel Briggs organized his soldiers into chalk formations, preparing them for rapid helicopter loading while Phoenix provided security overwatch. The Taliban forces had withdrawn to positions beyond effective small arms range, apparently having lost their appetite for continued combat against an enemy with close air support. The psychological impact of sustained gun runs had accomplished what hours of defensive fighting could not. It had broken the enemy's will to continue the engagement. As the first Black Hawk touched down in the improvised landing zone, Phoenix felt the satisfaction that comes from mission completion under the most challenging possible circumstances. She had arrived at precisely the right moment, engaged a numerically superior enemy force in complex terrain, and provided the kind of close air support that allowed surrounded soldiers to survive until extraction. It was the kind of mission that justified every hour of training, every gallon of fuel, and every round of ammunition in the Air Force inventory. The extraction proceeded smoothly, with each helicopter spending minimal time on the ground while Rangers loaded quickly and efficiently. Phoenix maintained her patrol pattern overhead, ready to engage any enemy forces that might try to interfere with the operation. But the Taliban fighters had apparently learned their lesson about challenging A-10 Thunderbolts in aerial combat. The mountains that had echoed with gunfire and explosions for hours now lay silent, except for the diminishing sound of rotor blades carrying American soldiers to safety. As the last Black Hawk disappeared over the southern ridge, Phoenix turned her aircraft toward home base, mentally composing the after-action report that would try to capture the events of the past 6 hours in the clinical language of military documentation. But she knew that no official report could adequately describe what had transpired in these mountains. The moment when surrounded soldiers discovered they weren't alone, the precision required to place cannon fire within meters of friendly forces, or the satisfaction of watching enemy combatants flee in panic from the sound of approaching turbofan engines. Phoenix's A-10 climbed away from the battlefield as the first rays of sunrise painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Below, the rocky terrain held the evidence of sustained combat, scattered equipment, blast craters, and the silence that follows violent encounters between professional soldiers. But it also held something else: the knowledge that 25 American Rangers had lived to see another dawn, because one pilot had decided that official mission parameters mattered less than the lives of soldiers in contact with the enemy. The flight back to base gave Phoenix time to decompress from the sustained combat operations, though the adrenaline residue would take hours to fully clear her system. She'd expended most of her ammunition and pushed her aircraft systems to their operational limits, but both pilot and machine had performed exactly as designed. The A-10 Thunderbolt II had once again proven its worth as the premier close air support aircraft in the American inventory, capable of operating in conditions that would ground other platforms. As she approached her home airfield, Phoenix began to understand that this mission would follow her throughout the rest of her military career, not because of any official recognition or commendations, but because of the radio transmissions from grateful soldiers and the knowledge that her flying skills had prevented a catastrophic loss of American lives. It was the kind of mission that defined careers and justified the existence of entire weapon systems. The landing was routine after the intensity of combat operations, wheels touching down on familiar concrete, engines spooling down to idle, the mundane checklist procedures that marked the transition from war back to peacetime operations. But as Phoenix shut down her systems and prepared to debrief the mission, she carried with her the voices of soldiers who had faced impossible odds and survived because someone was watching over them from the darkness above. Colonel Briggs and his Rangers would return to their forward operating base to rest, refit, and prepare for future missions. The wounded soldiers would recover in military hospitals thousands of miles from the mountains where they'd nearly died. The Taliban fighters would retreat to their strongholds and plan future operations, having learned hard lessons about the capabilities of American air power. And Phoenix would file her after-action report, resupply her aircraft, and prepare for the next mission that would test her skills against enemy forces in terrain where mistakes meant death and precision meant survival. But for now, in the quiet moments after engine shutdown, Phoenix allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at a job well done under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. She had answered the call when soldiers needed help, engaged a superior enemy force with precision and determination, and brought every American home alive. In a war where clear victories were rare and moral certainties even rarer, that was enough. That was everything. The debriefing session took place in a windowless conference room that smelled of stale coffee and military-issue disinfectant. Phoenix sat across from her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, methodically walking through the events of the previous night, while intelligence officers took notes and asked clarifying questions. The official version of the mission would become part of her service record, but it would also disappear into the classified archives, where such operations lived their bureaucratic afterlives. "Captain Restrepo," Harrison said, reviewing her preliminary report, "I need to understand how you came to be in that sector at 3:47 hours. Your flight plan showed a routine training mission in an entirely different area of operations." Phoenix had been expecting this question. The official answer was complicated by the unofficial realities of combat operations, where pilots sometimes found themselves making decisions that existed in the gray areas between orders and initiative. "Sir, I received an emergency beacon transmission on guard frequency while conducting low-altitude training exercises. Standard operating procedure required me to investigate and render assistance if possible." The intelligence officer, a major whose name Phoenix hadn't caught, looked up from his notes. "Captain, there's no record of any emergency beacon transmission in that sector at that time. Our communication logs show no distress signals from Viper 6 until after your initial contact." "Sometimes equipment doesn't work the way it's supposed to," Phoenix replied carefully. "Sometimes pilots have to make judgment calls based on incomplete information. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't necessarily the thing that generates the proper paperwork." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Phoenix with the expression of a senior officer who understood the complexities of modern warfare. He'd been flying combat missions since the first Gulf War, and he recognized the look of a pilot who had seen combat and performed exactly as trained. But he also understood that certain missions required creative interpretations of official orders, and that the best combat pilots were often those who knew when to ignore regulations in favor of results. "Captain Restrepo," he said finally, "your actions last night prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of American lives. Your flying was precise, your judgment was sound, and your results speak for themselves. The official record will reflect that you responded appropriately to an emergency situation while conducting authorized training operations in theater." The intelligence major closed his notebook and gathered his papers, apparently satisfied that the official version of events would serve everyone's purposes adequately. Phoenix knew that the real story of the previous night would live in different documents, classified at levels that prevented casual examination, filed in archives that historians might examine decades in the future when the tactical details mattered less than the strategic implications. As the debriefing concluded, Phoenix felt the weight of transition from combat operations back to routine military life. The adrenaline had finally cleared her system, replaced by the bone-deep exhaustion that follows sustained high-stress operations. She needed food, sleep, and time to process what had happened in the mountains above Afghanistan. But she also needed to prepare for the probability that similar missions lay ahead, because wars didn't pause for individual recovery.